So this is what we are going to achieve by the end of the video. So as you can see, I have a scriptable object called resources data. I can add any number of resources here. Let's say I want a diamond and I want a default amount of 100. And now if I play it, you can see we have the default amount here and a new variable called diamond is added. And if I update my resource, let's say my wood is being reduced. And if I exit the play mode and load it again, you can see rather than the default amount, it is loading the saved amount and we can easily expand it. Remove the items, let's say. I don't want diamond anymore. I want to remove gold as well. I will just subtract it over here. And yes, you can see now we only have two resources and you can easily access it anywhere, whether it is the singleton and you can edit any multiple types of resources you want. Let's say for a certain level, I want resource type 1 and on another map, I want a resource 2. So I will just duplicate it, change the types, change the name. I can change the default amount if needed. And over here, you can simply drag and drop, replace it. Now it's loading stone and iron. So it's simple as that, easily expandable, and you can add as many resources as you want, access it anywhere without much contradiction. So let's get started. So as you can see, I have a basic project set up here with a first person controller in it. So first thing we want to do is create the UI. So let's get into it. So this thing here is a placeholder for where we want to display our resources. We will use it to show whatever resources we own and whatever you have. So it is just for visual purpose. You can create it like any way you want depending on your game. So as you can see, I have added a horizontal layout group here. It will help us in arranging the items depending on the type of resources we have and how many resources we have. So as you can see, with the help of horizontal layout group, I can easily arrange my UI without having to do anything manual. So this way we can generate it in runtime depending on how many resources we have and how many resources we want to remove on the runtime without having to do much manually. For the tutorial, I will just use basic UI. You can use any UI you want, however you want it to look and however it suits your game. For now, I will just use the text to display the resource name. However, in your case, you might want to use a sprite or an image. So basically display what the resource will look like. But for the tutorial, I will just keep it simple and straightforward. So this object is our visual and it will hold all the components related to our resource display, like how we want to show it in the gameplay and how it will look when it's generated. So for it, I will create a script which will hold its component like the image, text or whatever you have created and it will assign, initialize and fetch if needed. So I will create a script and I will call it resource UI. I am using a namespace just to keep my project structure. You don't have to necessarily use it. It doesn't impact much. So up here, I have declared variables which will store our resource named and amount text basically, and it is a TMP text game object. You can declare any more variables you want here. Like let's say for example, you have created an image here, so you can just declare an image here. Or if you have any other custom variables like a custom script which you want to initialize, you can declare it here and so on. You can easily expand it. Now I will create an initialize method which will define the resource name text, resource on amount, and any other variables you need to be defined or whatever action you need to perform here. Next thing I am going to do is create a resource holder script, basically which will manage everything like what type of resource we own, whatever new resource we want to create, and whatever extra features we want to add in that. So I will just go with a scriptable object for that. And the reason I am going with a scriptable object is you can easily expand those if you have multiple types of resources or if you have any specific requirement, like in certain levels, you want to display some resources and in other, you want to display different type of resources. So you can create multiple variations by using only a single scriptable object and we don't have to modify it much. And in case we need to expand it, all of those will be expanded with one single script, which is our scriptable object we just created. Now, the reason I am closing my Visual Studio every time is because sometimes it doesn't refresh properly in my case. So yeah, that's the only reason. There is no other reason. You can also go to project settings and force regenerate files, but in my case, I feel this is simpler. So I will create a custom struct or a class based on your requirement, which will hold all the data regarding the resources, like what is its icon, what is its amount, or name, and whatever else you need. I want to mark this as a serializable field because I want it exposed in the inspector so that I can edit the values. Now, as I mentioned, in this tutorial, we are not adding image, but if you want to have a specific sprite, you can simply define it here. So you can edit it in the inspector and assign it to whatever value you want. So for example, I will write one here. So simply put, just like this, we can declare any variables we want and we will just access it through the resource data struct which we have just created. Now, as you can see, I have created an array of resource data, which we will define from the inspector. It allows users to enter as many resources as they want later on without changing anything in the script. So it is easily expandable and you can add any number of resources you want. So basically, this is just a method to retrieve our resource data. As you can see, it can be done by getters here, but I don't want to use the getters here because in future, if I want to add anything else or a specific condition while returning the resources, I can easily expand it. So I will just make it a method instead. So for now, this will be all which would go inside the resource data class. Later on, we can expand on it as we need. And in here, I will be accept a variable of resource data class which we struct which we just created. Also, one more thing, you want to create this struct outside of the class. So what will happen is I can access this struct from anywhere within my namespace. Otherwise, I will always have to mention resource data SCO before and then I can access it. So it will just make it easier for us to access. So I will keep it outside. And here I will just initialize the values based on the data we receive. Additionally, this can act as a default resource amount you want. But ideally what we want is to load our data for the amount value which we currently possess. You can use this as a default amount if you don't have any saved data before, but I would just demonstrate how we can do that easily if we have a saved data or not. I am using clear paths, but you can use any other thing you want like binary formatter or serialization in a JSON format. So it's totally up to you. But for simplicity, I will just go with the clear paths right now. Now, here I have declared a constant string because I know I will always be using the same name to access the clear path, whether it is saving, loading, or anything else. And as we have multiple resources, we cannot just use this. We need a prefix to determine which type of resource that is. So for that, I will go inside the resource data struct and I will create a enum here, which is a resource type basically. And here we can determine whatever type of resources we have. We can expand it as much as we want. If I want something else, for example, let's say I need a scrap. So I will just add scrap here. And similarly, we can expand it however we want. And as an identifier, I will just declare that enum over here. So this is our unique key for identifying what type of resource we want. You can use the resource name string as well if you want as a unique key, but it is like much more robust to use resource type enum rather than a string because there is no chance of misspelling or anything else if some developer or your team member changed it without you knowing. So this can help us in preventing further errors if there are any. Now, I will create a method which will simply return us the suffix which we want to load or save. You don't necessarily have to create it as a method, but I do it that way in case I need to access it in multiple places. So it just makes it easier. If you want, you can add overloads here to determine what specific type of data you want for a certain instance. Let's say, for example, in certain areas, you want a certain type of resource. Like in level 1, I only want to get a resource type A or B or something like that. So you can add overloads here and then customize the method as much as you need. I am changing it to a int or actually a float would be better for identifying if we have a resource or not. But if you need, you can make it a custom struct or a class to get multiple values, or you can use out. Now what it does is it will load our float if we have any. If not, it will return a default value of -1. This is what the overload does. So in here, we want to check if we have any default values. If we do, we will just replace our data with that value. And additionally, it would be better to create a float over here which will store how much amount we have, and in future if we modify it we can just update that float and we can proceed with it. Also, it would be better to remove this right now because we don't necessarily need to assign it over here. First we need to check if we have a overload. If we do, we will simply replace our earned amount and assign it to the earned amount. So as you can see, we are just comparing here. If our earned amount is -1, then we will simply replace it to our default amount which we will initialize. If not, we will simply load whatever the value we have. So with this simple method, we can save and load our resources, and similarly, we will create a method for saving our resources. So yeah, with this simple line of script, now we can save and load our resource and compare if we have any. If not, we will assign it to a default value. So this basically covers whatever we need for a basic resource UI setup. And now we want a manager which will instantiate the type of resources we have store its values, and whatever else we need regarding it. Now here we have created a resource data SCO, which is just our scriptable object script. So from here, we can assign what type of resources we want to load in case we have multiple types of resources. And in specific area, if we want to switch to the type of resources which are loaded, like let's say I'm switching a map between underworld and overworld, for example, in your game. In that case, you can show different type of resources here by replacing this data and initializing the resources again. So that is for the future expansion. In this tutorial, we will simply use one type of resource and just initialize it. Also, another thing which you might want to do, if your game is structured like that, you might want to create this as a singleton so you can easily access it anywhere. And if you only have one type of resources, you want to load it at the start, you can make it a persistent singleton so you can access it across the scenes and multiple levels basically without having to initialize it again and again on start on load of each level. However, I will just create it a singleton, not a persistent one in my case, because for the demonstration purpose. Now, if you don't know what a singleton is, it is basically a static instance of the class which we can access throughout, and it will only have one single instance of it throughout the level or a scene. So basically, this is just a helper class. I have already written it. What it does it takes the mono behavior and on awake, it initializes its instance. And if there is another object of same type and this is not initialized, it will destroy that game object. Sorry, if it is initialized, it will destroy this game object. So yeah, that's all it does. And I have overloads here. You can expand on it if needed. Like I have a persistent one and so on. You can expand it like that. But yeah, that is not the focus of tutorial. So let's get ahead. So this right here will basically be the UI which we have just created with the horizontal layout group to instantiate the children. And the children will be our resource UI type of objects because it is holding all the UI and initialization properties, etc. So as you can see, we are using the method which we have created earlier just to get resources available, which we are going to define in the inspector through scriptable object. Now this loop will basically iterate through all the resources which we have and instantiate one of its variable and then it will initialize it based on our initialize method on the resource data which we have defined. Now over here, we can also create another method to update the type of resources like adding it, getting it, and etc. And over here, you might want to declare a overload in case you want to save that updated amount of resource or not. So I can simply do that by creating a bool and the default value is true. So you do not have to initialize it every time. Like let's say I want to update my money. So I will just call this method and pass the amount here. I don't have to initialize this every time. But in case there is a overload, let's say there is a point where resource has been reduced, but I don't want to save that value unless I am saving my game. So in that case, I can pass a overload of false. So it will not save it by default because we will add a conditional here. Over here, we will create a list which will hold our resource UI type of objects to access all the resources which are instantiated and manage those within the resource manager. You can initialize it at start as well, or if you want, you can initialize it inside this initialize method as well. Because when we are initializing, we are initially overriding our previous UIs if we have any. Now, here we will create a method which will determine whether we can get a resource if there is a certain amount passed. So what it will do is it will check however the amount of resources we have earned. If we have enough resources, we will simply update our resource and return a bool whether it's true or false. You can create a lot of methods like that. Like if you want to directly get a type of resource, it will return the float amount which is currently there, etc. So for example, I will create a few methods and expand it over here. Now this is a simple method which checks through our list if there is any type of resource which we need to get. You can add a null check here to determine whether you have that type of resource or not, and you can log an error, debug warning, or whatever you want. But for the tutorial, I will not add it, but I will add a comment in case anyone need a reference. So over here, we will first get the type of resource which we want to compare with. As you can see, you can add a false return here as well, but we will not do it for the tutorial. Now what we are doing here is, if we want to update the value, we are updating the resource value as well. If we don't want to update the value by default, which is the overload which we have defined, we will simply return true. And if we cannot use that resource because of the amount we have passed, we will simply return false. Another method you can add is to update the resource directly via here in case you don't want to check it's usable or not. So I will do that. So what it is doing is getting that resource type and directly updating it without comparing the amount. So similarly, you can expand for the similar methods. Now let's just assign all the scripts which we have created. I will create a prefab so I can directly instantiate it. Also, if you want, you can simply delete it, but I like to keep it in here because in future, if I want to change this, let's say my looks or anything else, I can directly select if it to true or false and change it, apply the override over here, and I will have no problem in seeing how it looks after changing it. So it's just for convenience. I will just keep it to false. I have attached an empty to the resource manager. This will hold all the resources, instantiate, and whatever else we want to do. And for this field, we will create a scriptable object. Oh, one main thing which I forgot is to make it a scriptable object. So yeah, I have just created it as a scriptable object. And now if I go to the inspector, I should be able to create it. Now, as you can see over here, I can create any number of resources which way I want to create. And let's say I want to give a default amount of 100. And now, as I mentioned, if we have a sprite, we can assign it over here, but we are not even using it. But I will keep it there just for the sake of it. And let's say I want another resource, which I call metal. Oh, it's not there. Let's just call it iron then. Actually, one more thing I want to demonstrate is if I call it metal and demonstrate it via iron, that will work as well. Visually, we will see it as a metal, but internally we are determining it by the enum iron. So it's just for our sake. For the visual part, user will see whatever name we define here. So it don't have to match the enum name. It's just for the convenience, which I have kept it same. And let's say I want its default amount to be 0. So we will do that. And over here, we will simply assign that scriptable object. So this is now the type of resources which I want. And similarly, if I had any other resources which I want, I will just duplicate it. I will add, remove, or whatever I want over here. But for now, let's just test it. Oh, we forgot to call the initialize method. So ideally, if you have a game manager or something like that, you want to initialize it via that. But let's consider you don't have anything like that. So I will just do it in the start. So I will go to resource manager, start, and initialize, and that's it. Okay, there's an error. Let's just address it quickly. Since resource name is not being initialized. Oh, so we accidentally added two scripts over there, which is not what we want because it gets the first component by default. So I will just remove that. So what we did was we assigned the scenes reference over here. So on runtime, the prefab was destroyed and it was getting a missing reference. So always remember, don't assign it via scene. You need to assign it directly from here. Now, as you can see, our resources are over there being generated. I have wood, I have metal, and the default amount which I have defined. And just for the testing purpose, I will quickly create a method which will update our resource type. And over here, I want to update my resource count. Let's say wood, and I want to decrease it. So I will add -10. Now, if you see, I have wood 100 by default. Then if I press R, my wood is now 90. And if I press it again, it is 80 because of the method we have defined. And if I exit the play mode and then play again, you can see it will load the default amount of 80 because we have saved that amount and loading it via player prefs. Similarly, now we can easily expand it. We just need to add an item here, rename it to gold. I will call it gold and I want a default amount of 10. So I will add it there. Now you can see we have three types of resources. And with this system, you can access it anywhere throughout the script. For example, I have a radial crafting system over here. Let's say I want to access it here. I will simply call if let's manager dot instance dot check resource usable. And let's say I have an item with certain cost. So I can pass it over there. And right now in the items, I have not defined the type. So you can simply define the resource type. For instance, I will just use wood. So over here, it will check if I have uh, enough amount to craft a certain item and use the resource type wood by default because we don't have it set up yet, but it will work like that. And I can simply do whatever I want, like adding some item, etc. So yeah, with this, you can easily expand your resource system, call it anywhere you want easily. And in case you want to add more items, you can easily access it in the resource UI script, which handles overall UI data. So that's it, guys. Thank you for watching. If you like my content, you can consider subscribing